Thank you so much for all of you joining us today. My name is Tanya Mickelson, and I'm the events manager at Columbia Land Trust. Usually our summer, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, is filled with tours, volunteer outings, and other engagement events. And since we aren't able to host in-person gatherings quite yet, we're really excited to bring some opportunities to learn more about our work to you. Today's presentation is part of an installment of our virtual eco-regional tour series, where we will be offering virtual learning opportunities and conversation, taking a closer look at the landscapes we work within, the wildlife, people, and communities that make them unique. Our first ecoregion tour is focusing on the coast. We will be rolling out more ecoregion tours this summer, so be sure to check back at our website for more details. Today's presentation will include an overview of our conservation work in the coast, and we'll hear an overview of our work as well as from a couple of marbled murrelet experts who will be talking about a really unique bird species that finds its home on the coast in the region we work in. Before I introduce our program today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. This is a Zoom webinar, so although you'll be able to see and hear our panelists, know that all of our participants will be muted. So be sure to use the chat feature to communicate any thoughts or questions during today's presentation. And at the end of our presentation, we'll be facilitating a Q&A session with our presenters. And so during that piece of the presentation, you can use either the chat feature or the Q&A box to enter in any questions you'd like our presenters to address. We are going to be recording today's webinar, and we'll share the link after the event. So I'd now like to turn it over to our panelists for introductions.
Oh, I can just get it. Oh, there we are. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Mendoza. I'm conservation lead for the Columbia Land Trust, and I'm based in the Story office.
Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Tomlinson. I'm the coastal land steward for Columbia Land Trust, and I'm speaking to you from today from Gearhart, Oregon.
Hi, I'm Kim Nelson, and I'm faculty at Oregon State University in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and I am in Corvallis, Oregon.
Yes, and I'm Paul Engelmeyer. I manage land for Portland Audubon Society at 10 Mile Creek Sanctuary, and I manage land for Wetlands Conservancy in Alsea Bay, Beaver Creek, and Yaquina Bay.
Okay, great. Well, I'll get us started today. So I wanted to start by briefly talking about the Land Trust Coast Ecoregion and how it fits into the overall work of the Land Trust. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of familiar names on the attendees list. So this might be an overview for some of you, or review. So this is a map of our entire service area, and all the lands highlighted in yellow is lands that we have already conserved, and that's the case for the next two maps too. So our service area stretches from the John Day River east of the Cascades to the Pacific Ocean, stretching 50 miles north and south of the Columbia into both Oregon and Washington. And within our service area, we have 5 ecoregions, which you can see there. Oh, go back, there you go, see on the map. And today we're just going to be focusing on the coast ecoregion and estuaries region, coast range and estuaries ecoregion, and marbled murrelet, which are present in this ecoregion. Okay, Tanya, you can flip forward. Okay, so here is an aerial of just the coast ecoregion. some things that I think stand out for this ecoregion and what kind of guides our conservation planning here are, well, obviously the forests. We all probably know that our temperate rainforests here are some of the most productive forests in the world. They're rich sources of biodiversity. They have the potential to sequester large amounts of carbon and mitigate for climate change, which is something the Land Trust is thinking more and more about as we do conservation planning. And they also provide employment, recreation, timber. So there's a lot of different pressures placed on these forests. And then another major feature of this ecoregion is the Columbia River estuary and its associated wetlands. So estuaries, basically just where the river meets the ocean, are also some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They serve as a nursery for a number of different fish species, clams, oysters, provide habitat for countless numbers of birds and other wildlife. They're also among the most threatened habitats because this is where a lot of development and farming takes place. And then we also have Willapa Bay, which is another kind of spectacular large estuary. And the people are also very much an important part of this landscape. Here in our coast ecoregion, we have a few different population centers, nothing like what we'll have in our Willamette Valley ecoregion, but we have Warrington, Astoria, Owako. These communities are historically, the economies have been very natural resource dependent with farming, fishing, logging, still major industry, still very important, but maybe to a lesser extent than what they once were. And tourism, of course, is a major industry now. And it's also important to note that this area, our coast ecoregion, is the land of the Chinook Nation, and the Chinook tribes still reside in, very active around the lower Columbia region. So next slide, Tanya. So most of the land trust conservation work on the coast right now centers around forests, tidal wetlands, and community. We're working to protect older forests and setting the stage for growing new old forests, older, more structurally diverse forests. And we're also doing a lot of work around conserving and restoring tidal wetlands around the estuary. And as in all of our ecoregions, we're working to build relationships and engage diverse communities on the coast to guide the work that we do, to connect people to nature and to support our local communities. And to do this work effectively, we've developed these conservation opportunity areas, which you can see on this map, where we're concentrating our work over the next 20 years or so. And the Group 1 conservation areas, which are in green there, are where we're focusing our work right now. And so on the coast, the Group 1 area, the Grays River watershed, and the Willapa Hills. And so I think now we're just going to zoom into the Willapa Hills and east side of Willapa Bay, where we recently acquired a property from Marble Murrelet Habitat. And Austin's going to give you a tour and talk about how we manage this forest.
Thanks, Lydia. Conserving our region's remaining older forests is obviously limited. For one, there isn't much left, and two, the remaining older forests in our region lies in a patchwork across a variety of private and public ownership. Therefore, in order to have more older forests conserved in the future, Columbia Land Trust often finds itself acquired forest land is often young, degraded, overstocked, and more of a plantation style forest with little to no resemblance of old growth characteristics. To achieve these old growth characteristics and expedite the process of reaching that goal, many of the young and industrialized forests that Columbia Land Trust acquires often requires some form of management. The following video I'm going to show you guys is my attempt to kind of explain the type of forest management, restoration management, which is different from the standardized silvicultural approach to forest management. I will make a note that there are some new words or terminologies spoken about in the video, and I apologize for this. And if there are any questions as a result of what specific word means or concepts mean, I'm happy to answer or try to answer that during the question and answer section. But for now, I'll give you at least a definition of a silviculture, since it is frequently used in the video. Silviculture is the practice of controlling growth, composition, structure, and quality of forest to meet values and needs. The names come from Latin silvi for forest and culture for growing. I also will note that many of the practices and concepts discussed in the video are tailored more to coastal forests. It's not all-encompassing. Forests in the Cascades or the east side of our region would likely utilize different restoration methods. Also, the images in the video were taken using a drone on Columbia Land Trust property, and it is narrated by myself. So I am a little bit tired of listening to my own voice after all the editing, so I might not even listen to the video. A majority of the images are within the 1,200 acres of forest and riparian land that we manage along the east side of Willapa Bay in Pacific County, Washington. This also includes the recent addition of 600 acres of occupied Murrelet habitat that we just closed within the last month in the Willapa Hills Conservation Area. Also, another note is that some of you guys may experience some lag in viewing the video based on your internet speed and connection. So we will be posting the video on YouTube, on our YouTube page afterwards if anybody has any issues viewing the video. So I hope you enjoy.
Of biodiversity. Function is the work carried out by an ecosystem, including processes such as productivity, the conservation of nutrients, and the regulation of hydrologic cycles. Structure, which includes both the variety of individual structures, such as trees, snags, and logs of various sizes and conditions, as well as managing these highly altered forests and putting them on a trajectory towards a desired future condition that supports a variety of wildlife while providing critical ecological and community services such as clean water, public access to nature, and carbon sequestration, often requires intervention and long-term management. To help us understand forest ecosystems, there are three main attributes to consider: composition, function, and structure, which are often utilized to help us make these management decisions. Composition is the variety and proportion of various species present, a major aspect of biodiversity. Function is the work carried out by an ecosystem, including processes such as productivity, the conservation of nutrients, and the regulation of hydrologic cycles. Structure, which includes both the variety of individual structures, such as trees, snags, and logs of various sizes and conditions, as well as the spatial arrangement of these structures, such as whether they are uniformly spaced or clumped. Of course, all of these three attributes change throughout the successional development of forest stands. Old growth as a desired future condition can mean using the structure and function of current old growth stands as a goal for manipulating plantations. This is a challenge because current old growth stand structure represents centuries of succession, disturbance, and climate change, pathways of development that probably will not be repeated in nature or through silvicultural manipulations. More realistically, it means altering conditions and plantations to more closely match what we know about the structure and dynamics of old growth stands when they were young. This would include manipulating structure and composition to create conditions in young stands that would be more likely to develop the general feature of old growth forest over time than if they were left alone. Management of these dense conifer plantations to restore ecological diversity and reset pathways towards desired old growth structure and composition involves a variety of silvicultural prescriptions. 1. Reduce stem density, in which to increase rates of growth to produce large diameter trees, as well as encourage development of large and deep crowns. 2. Use a variable density approach to create spatial heterogeneity to promote understory development and diversity. 3. favor hardwoods and other conifer species that would have otherwise been eliminated under intensive management of timber production. 4. Plant shade-tolerant tree species where seed sources of desired species are lacking in the stand or landscape. And 5. Don't use the same prescription everywhere. Vary the density and frequency of silvicultural entries. All of these concepts and management strategies we hope will result in a more diverse and sound forest ecosystem. Our coastal forests are unique, beautiful, and essential, not only to us, but those species that utilize their canopies, burrow in their soil, utilize their vegetation, and swim along their edges.
I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and now we're going to hear from Kim Nelson from Oregon State University.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm going to give a presentation on murrelet ecology to let you know about this unique bird and why I like it so much. I've been studying marbled murrelets since 1988 throughout the Pacific area where they occur. Okay, see if I can get it to go to the next slide. Oops. Okay, so marbled murrelets were first described in the late 1700s, but we've only started to learn about this species recently. Early scientists and naturalists wrote papers on marbled murrelets in the early 1900s entitled things like, "Where does the marbled murrelet nest? Does the marbled murrelet nest inland?" And they had no idea where these birds, which are related to puffins and other birds in the alcid family, they thought they should be nesting on the offshore rocks where you find the puffins, but no one could ever find a nest. They forgot to ask the Native Americans, though. The Native Americans knew a lot about marbled murrelets. They knew about their bill-up display, their beautiful dance that's in the lower center of this slide. The birds, male and female, will swim along with their bill up in the air together, and then they'll dive into the water and come back up and call to one another. The Native Americans knew about these birds. They knew they nested inland. They have stories about the birds being found in the trees. And they have this beautiful ceremonial hat. This is from the Tlingit tribe in Southeast Alaska that they used in dances. They wouldn't eat the marbled murrelet because they revered it. And they ate a lot of the other alcids, including puffins. It wasn't until 1974 that the first murrelet nest was found in Big Basin Redwood State Park in California. And National Audubon Society was finally able to give its $100 reward that it had offered for anybody to find the first nest. It was found accidentally by a climber who was climbing up a tree to cut off a limb in a campground, and there was a chick sitting on the limb. The first nest in Oregon was not found until 1990 by myself and my crews, and the first Washington nest was found in 1990. And there are nests in the NEMA stand, which is one of the stands that is in this area that we're discussing today. Everyone thinks that the marbled murrelet is unique, like it's the only alcid that nests inland, but there are 3 species in the Brachyramphus genus: the marbled murrelet, the long-billed murrelet, which occurs in Russia and Japan, and the Kitlitz's murrelet, which occurs in Alaska and Russia. All 3 of these species fly far inland to nest, and they all have 2 different distinct plumages: a breeding plumage, which allows them to be cryptic at the nest site, and a non-breeding plumage that they carry during the winter time when they're not going inland to their nests. Both the marbled murrelet and the long-billed murrelet nest in trees and on the ground. So in the northern portion of their range, marbled murrelets do nest on the ground. The Kitlitz's murrelet only nests on the ground, but these species are very similar in their behaviors. All of these species are sensitive, and the marbled murrelet is listed as a threatened species by the federal government and is listed as endangered in Washington and California. Well, where do you find marbled murrelets if they're out on the ocean? They forage in the near shore. They forage in shallow water. They don't dive further than 50 meters or about 150 feet. So we do counts in the near shore with boats, and we look at densities of birds. And I have pictured here the Oregon coast with these blue bars. The longer the bar, the higher the densities. So you can see that on the central Oregon coast is the most important place for murrelets in Oregon, because inland from there is the Siuslaw National Forest, which has a lot of habitat. The birds just sit on the water and then they'll dive underneath the water and chase schooling fish. They're generalist feeders and they'll eat anything, any small fish, and they also eat crustaceans on occasion. Well, where do you find them inland? They fly inland as far as 55 miles. The farthest inland they fly is in Washington in the North Cascades. They breed primarily in older age forests, so mostly mature and old growth forests. And the reason they need these large trees is that they don't build a nest. They lay their egg just on a limb. And so they need a large limb, and generally larger limbs grow on larger trees. So here's a nesting platform from the Tillamook ODF land in Oregon. And you could see that's a fairly small limb, but it was big enough for a nest. The adults lay their egg, and when the chick is on the nest for 30 days, 30 to 40 days, you'll see this fecal ring around the edge of the nest. We can identify these nests years and years later by looking for this depression in the moss. The fecal matter disappears after a little while, but then there's also these landing pads where the birds come in to land. And we can find those because if a nest is used repeatedly over a number of years, the moss is usually missing or matted down from on the landing pads from the birds landing. So they only lay a single egg, and they lay that between April and July, and they incubate it for about 30 days. The chick then hatches, and the adult stays and broods the chick for 1 to 2 days, and then both adults will leave the chick on the nest alone for 28 to 40 days, and usually that's between June and September. The chicks grow by keeping their downy plumage, which is a brownish plumage, on top of their juvenile feathers. So they don't look like the black and white bird here until right before they're going to fledge, and they'll pluck off all their feathers, and all of a sudden they'll be black and white, which would be very obvious to a predator. So they keep that downy plumage for a long time. The nests are also highly concealed. Everything about their behavior is to not be found in the nest site. They don't call a lot from the nest. They fly during the early morning hours, and they don't make a lot of noise in the nest. And then the chick has that downy plumage until right before it fledges. These birds live about 15 years, but they could live longer. I've been doing some work on Japanese murrelets in Japan, and we just recaptured a bird that was actually 20 years old, and they're about the same size as a marbled murrelet, which is about 9 inches in length, about the size of a dove. We don't think they breed until at least 2 years and 3 years of age. Again, they only lay 1 egg, like I mentioned, so they have a very low reproductive rate, and they're not always successful. Birds have a high site fidelity, meaning they return to the same forest stand year after year, and Paul and I have done surveys in stands that were determined to be occupied in the early 1990s, and they're still occupied today. The birds don't always use the same nest, and we think this is another strategy for avoiding predation, where they alternate between nest trees between years within a small area. There are lots of threats to this species, both at sea and inland. Inland, the main ones are habitat loss and fragmentation. We don't know what happens to them if their stand is cut down. If you have an area where you have alternative forest within a small area, they probably move over to the nearest stand. But if there are large areas with no suitable habitat, we think that they don't breed again, and that's what happens when puffins and other alcids lose their nesting sites. One thing that we've learned from studying the birds is that when you have a clear cut and when it grows back in lots of berry bushes, like elderberry, then that draws predators in, especially Steller's jays. So maybe creating buffers, purchasing habitat, doing some management to it to make old growth characteristics, and then putting buffers on the habitat might help to keep the predators away. Their main predators are corvids. The raven and Steller's jays are the key predators. About 70% of Murrelet nests fail every year, and about 90% of that failure is from predation. So there's a lot of nests that aren't successful, and since they only lay one egg and rarely relay an egg, then their reproduction is very low. I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing on the Oregon coast. We're capturing birds at sea and putting tags on them. We go out at night on the Pack Storm, which is Oregon State University's boat. We launch a Zodiac. So we launch 3 people at night in a Zodiac, one with a headlamp and a bright light. One's driving the boat, and then the person in the front has a big net, and they can get the Murrelet to freeze like a deer sometimes and catch it in the net. And if that doesn't work, they can shine the light down in the water, and the Murrelet will the Murrelet will swim up towards the light, and they can reach out and grab them with a net. So we measure them, we band them, and we put this little VHF tag on them. Unfortunately, satellite tags aren't working on these birds yet because they aren't small enough. This is only about a 2 to 3 gram tag. Once we put the tag on the birds, we take a little blood so that we can sex them because they look identical, male and female look identical. And we also get information on whether they have blood parasites and other information. We keep the birds for less than 30 minutes and then release them. We track them in 2 different ways, by flying in planes and using our antennas along shoreline. Our main core area is between Pacific City and Florence, 75 miles along the central Oregon coast. We've flown flights all the way down to San Francisco Bay when we've lost some of our birds. And especially in 2017, many of our birds went to California instead of breeding because of poor ocean conditions. Once we find a nest, we put a cool little camera up and we camouflage it so it's not well seen. And this is in a different tree. We're not allowed to climb the nest tree. We have a camera on the ground that crew can go monitor and watch what's happening at the nest site. So this is one of the nests that we found. On this project, we've found 12 nests so far, all in the Siuslaw National Forest and all in older age forests. I want to show you a couple of little videos here from the nest site. This is the first one. I mentioned that the chick is brooded for just a couple of days after it hatches, and then both adults leave for the ocean. So you don't often get to see this, but here's oops. Let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. You'll see the little chicks stick his head out when the adult stands up. You can see the little tiny chick there, about a 1 or 2 day old chick. That's about the best view we get of the chick in those first day. This is an adult that's come back with a fish. They carry a whole fish from the ocean, fly all the way with it to give it to the chick. They'll stand at the nest for a little while, making soft running noise to the chick, and then the adult will fly off and the chick will eat the fish. They eat it whole and head first, and unfortunately in this video the chick turns its head so we can't see it swallow the whole fish. And just to warn you on this one, there's a lot of predation on Murrelet nests, and so this is a predation event, but it's by a species that this was the first recorded documentation of this species ever depredating a Murrelet nest. Oh, See if I can get it go. There we go. So that's a red-tailed hawk that came in to take the chick, and this nest was on the edge. And so, you know, red-tailed hawks do forage along the edges, and so that's another issue with habitat fragmentation. And that's all I have to talk about the ecology of the murrelet. I'm going to turn this over to Paul Engelmeyer, and Paul and I have worked together for many years. We do a joint program on the Oregon coast, a murrelet survey that we're having a presentation this summer, but not the actual field work. But we have people come and they get to go out and see murrelets in the forest and on the water. And that's a really fun thing to do. So hopefully in 2021, some of you can come down to Oregon to Yachts and join us for that. I'll turn this over to Paul.
Yes, I think you need to turn me on. There we go. Says you can't start because the host has stopped it.
Go ahead and try to share your screen again, Paul.
Okay. Here we go. Can you see that?
No, can't see that.
How about now?
Can't see it, Paul.
Well,
So Paul, if you go ahead and click share screen, and then there should be an option for you to select desktop. And then make sure you click that and then hit share. There we go.
we're getting closer.
You're on.
Good. Okay, so I manage land for Portland Audubon Society and for Wetlands Conservancy here on the Central Coast. And those parcels that I manage are actually occupied murrelet stands. So I've been dealing with marbled murrelet issues since the early 90s on the OSU Wildlife Research Crew with Kim as their climber and photographer, and then more towards conservation issues and strategies after that. And so I get to deal with landscape conservation similar to the land trust, the Columbia Land Trust, but I work for multiple organizations on these focal areas. And so this is a 80,000 acre chunk of land with 2 wildernesses, Yachats on the north and Hasita Lighthouse on the south. And it's been identified as a globally significant important bird area. So if you don't know, Birdlife International out of London established the Important Bird Area program internationally. And for Oregon, they pulled a bunch of folks together, identified about 100 locations around the state. 30 of them are on the coast. There are important bird areas. And then they can be an important bird area or a hemispheric important bird area or a globally significant IBA, important bird area. So we gathered the data on known occupied sites and had that information about the nearshore densities, and BirdLife International says that hits the globally significant category. So 10 Mile Creek, the sanctuary, is about 5 miles from the ocean. and again is surrounded by the National Forest. And we do protection and restoration, education, work with the Forest Service and the community. This is Angel Job Corps, and they're a forestry crew that are learning restoration activities, restoration forestry, snag creation, trail maintenance, a list of skills. And this was a slide that you saw from Kim. And then for Wetlands Conservancy, here at south of Newport, it was Brian Boos State Park, and the community engaged with Wetlands Conservancy to buy a chunk of land. And then we did an easement on an adjacent land, an occupied stand. So we get to work with the state parks and the community in this watershed. So the previous one was working more with the community and National Forest, and this one is state parks. So now that's a Brian Boos State Park, occupied Murrelet stands, and it's about 1,000-acre state park, more or less, with Wetlands Conservancy in the middle of it. And I want to draw attention to one of the tools that we're using more, and I'm sure that your trust does, but maybe the community is not aware of it, which is this laser imaging, LIDAR. And so this is just a tool that you can get a hold of through Dogami, Department of Geology Minerals. They're in Corvallis, or I'm sure you can figure out where it is. But it's capable of actually telling you the heights of trees, right on down to, oh, it's 0 to 10 feet, 40 feet, 80 feet, 120, over 200 or over two. So this little block on the right was a recent acquisition that the state parks completed. And then there's a BLM chunk right next to it. And so these are how we identify core areas and then try and build on them through acquisitions and conservation easements. And then so when we talk about recovery planning, so this is kind of like my take on where we could and should, and in some cases are going. But there's so much work ahead of us. And when we talk about by zone, the Murrelet is up and down the whole coast. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has established zones. We're on the Central Coast, Zone 3. And then within those zones, there's an opportunity to talk about identifying and prioritizing issues, landscape conservation for multiple species. And so that's something a land trust should really be savvy to, is the state's conservation strategy. So as we talk about protecting Murrelet habitat, priority endangered species, older forest, really unique, you got to buffer it. The whole routine is an amazing conservation strategy. But nestled within that conservation strategy will be these other species, whether it's the flying squirrel or maybe the Humboldt martin, as just examples. And so that's something that you folks could incorporate into your next presentation. The Humboldt martin's an amazing story, or the flying squirrel. And so coordinating these regional forest management, creating blocks of habitat and partnerships is really where it's going. And if you ask your state park, hey, do you got a Corvid management plan? Probably not. How about identifying acquisitions and opportunity areas by each zone? That's a work plan for us. And so working with your state park, all these things are where we need to go. So for us on the Central Coast, I get to work with state parks, Siuslaw National Forest Service, the watershed councils in these engagement processes. And then when we talk about, of course, funding and make sure there's materials at these state parks, at these visitor centers, and acknowledging the fact that we've got a long way, especially since these birds, the average nest ballpark is like 170 feet or so. And so long-term vision, blocks of habitat, it's an amazing process that we're in the middle of. And so there's a couple of issues on the horizon, which the Fish and Wildlife Commission going to be talking about uplisting to an endangered status, which we are urging them to move forward with that. Big controversial issue, because once it gets endangered status, then you can initiate survival guidelines and a recovery plan and a monitoring strategy on private lands. So these are things that we need to deal with. And of course, you need a funding mechanism, and whether it's tax incentives for acquisitions and easements to protect some of these occupied stands. And of course, under endangered species, you got what's called Section 6. It's a funding source for recovery strategies. And the most recent success story is this Land and Water Conservation Fund, where bipartisan support on making that permanent. And so So that's another tool in the toolbox that some of us have used for acquiring land. And then, of course, a monitoring strategy, long-term sites. These are things that the agencies and partnerships and land trusts, this is where we need to go. And for us on the Central Coast, we've been doing these community science monitoring efforts for about 15 years in long-term sites. And so and these are, you can pretty much say, you will see and hear birds. These are known occupied sites. It's a really good, a good experience. Of course, this year isn't going to float that way. And then, of course, in the ocean, there's a marine conservation strategy that we should be acknowledging, because there's a big push for dealing with marine renewable energy, wind and wave issues. How does that play in with the Murrelet? Yet to be determined. Have they even designated marine habitat as critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act? And so, so these are issues. One of the good success stories is we, the conservation community, in federal waters, initiated this forage fish management plan. It's in the Pacific Fishery Management Council under their ecosystem-based management strategy. So that was a number of years to make that happen. But now that's now incorporated into the state waters, 0 to 3. So that was a big push that was successful. And so this is one success that took a long time, but it's now in play. As a precautionary approach to managing prey base for multiple seabirds. And then, of course, this marine spatial planning, again, is in play around the whole West Coast. It's around the world, is how do you divvy up the ocean for long-term fishing, long-term conservation, marine reserves, marine protected area. This is on the horizon. It's something that we need to do. And so these are things that the public can engage with. And so for us on the Central Coast, we deal with national forest management and trying to incorporate these precautionary approaches to their thinning regimes. And I deal with like the Deadwood, which is the Sayula landscape planning area, 30,000 acres, and then the BLM chunk. And then, of course, you on the North Coast, you've got the habitat conservation plans up there. And then down further south of us is the Elliott. So these are opportunities for engagement. And we need all the help we can. And so we'll do another virtual training in July for this Murrelet survey. And then there will be a handful of folks will get to go out to our 6 locations is what we expect. This COVID-19 thing has really got everybody changing their work plan on how we engage with the public out in the field. And so this is just an example. You probably may have heard the phrase. Some folks describe it as flying potatoes, and they scream by at 50 miles an hour. It's really an amazing thing to see. And there's a whole crumb clean campaign that is interagency. And if you don't have these flyers, these are things that we share with campgrounds and any place in the woods where the people are. And then I've got this a set of links, which are videos and books. Rare Bird by Maria Mudd-Ruth, awesome book. And then background materials from various Audubon Society, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, OSU. So these are web links to that information. And if you want information on the uplisting to a endangered status, that's the link on the bottom with ODFW. And so we'll need support on that as well. So all these things are opportunities for engagement and raising awareness and appreciation as we incorporate these landscape conservation principles into play. It is for the Murrelet, but there's a whole suite of species that are in the wake of that little seabird. So that's what I have for today.
Great. Well, we can take questions if anyone has any. You can put in the question and answer box or in the chat box. I guess I'll start it off just because I'm curious. And this question goes to either Paul or Kim. This might be kind of existential, but what do you say to people who may not understand why we should care if this bird goes extinct or not? Like, what is lost if this bird is lost?
Well, you know, everything's connected, and some people got to learn about the web of life and in science class and usually in middle school, but some people have never heard about it. And that's a great question, because what does it matter if we don't have the marbled murrelet anymore? Well, one thing to think about is the fecal matter that the chicks leave at the nest site actually fertilizes the forest. And just like they're finding out that salmon that die as they after they lay their eggs and they die upstream, the salmon are fertilizing the forest with the dead carcasses. And so the same is happening with this fecal matter. It's allowing more moss to grow. It's fertilizing the tree. Without that you don't have that input from the canopy with so much fecal material that it is actually fish-based. There aren't any other birds that nest in the forest that have fish-based fecal matter. And so, that's one thing to point out. At sea in the near shore, if you don't have the marbled murrelet, then, maybe some species of fish would overtake other species of fish and everything would be out of balance. So when you take out any cog in the wheel starts to fall apart.
Paul, I have a question for you. You talked about the forage fish management plan. What specific, what encompasses forage fish, and how does that kind of play a role in the marmoratus, how they feed?
Well, I thought I had a slide in there with the 5 priority prey base for the murrelet. And so in the past, the agency would kind of go along the lines of, oh my gosh, look, there's a bunch of herring. It's a developmental fishery. Let's go have at it, with no population estimate. No, is the population going up or down? Is it stable? And you could talk about anchovies, sardines, sand lance. Historically, Eulicon, murrelet may or may not have eaten Eulicon, but you've got this suite of species that are in the food web. And so in the past, there was very little understanding of those populations, distribution, and in the estuary. And so now the agency has this ecosystem-based management strategy that they have to establish guidelines about abundances before we open up the fishery like in the past. So it's a precautionary approach, which is a movement in the right direction.
Kim, do we know how many individuals are in Oregon? Or
well,
yeah,
population estimates are done at sea surveys that are done, and they're done every other year now instead of every year because of lack of funding. But the estimated population in Oregon goes from 7,000 to about 20,000 birds, and that's a huge interval. And the reason is because the birds are so ephemeral, they move around, and so our confidence around the estimates is not very good. So if there's only 7,000 birds, then we're really in trouble. If there's 20,000 birds, they might be doing a little bit better. In Washington, the latest estimates range from about 9,000 to about 15,000 birds, but they're declining significantly.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Des. She asked, if you were visiting the coast, where can one go to get him to see a marbled murrelet, and what time of day?
Yeah, you can, from shore, if you have a spotting scope, you can go to almost any pullout and look through the scope and look for the murrelets in the near shore, just beyond the breakers, usually with the scoters and the other near shore foraging seabirds. It takes a little while to figure out which ones the murrelets are, and a lot of people will pick out a common murre and say, there's one. Well, if you find a common murre, know that it's less than half the size of that, so you're looking for a little tiny bird. As far as in the forest, you have to be there before dawn. So if you're camping in a campground, say Oswald West State Park on the North Oregon coast, that's a great place to, of course they close the campground there, but if you're nearby, you can hear murrelets there. A lot of the state parks, almost all of them are occupied by murrelets. So if you're able to get there early in the morning, you could go to any one of those state parks and hear birds. And then some of the Forest Service campgrounds as well.
Okay, great. And then we have a question from Tanya, she asks, what is the best thing for us as individuals to do? What can individuals do to help protect marbled murrelet habitat?
You want me to try and answer that a little bit?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Paul.
Well, I guess the first thing is do you have a checkbook? We could buy land. Okay, if you can't buy land, identify them, and then work with your land trust, work with your state agency, federal agency, Department of Forestry, on acknowledging the fact that it might be an occupied stand, so you can learn how to do your surveys, know what you're looking for, and try and protect old growth forests. This is what we've got going. And so Austin said it earlier, we've got a fragmented landscape, and it's going to take a long time to recover. And so for us in our bioregion to talk about core areas for conservation, with the Elliott down south of us, with our Cummins 10-mile block, the Drift Creek Wilderness block, you know, you've got these core areas that we can build on. So Dr. Reed Noss identified conservation opportunity areas of the state's conservation strategy. All those things will lead us in a direction about identifying core areas. And that would be one thing. Educate yourself, get to know landscape, and advocate for protecting those patches that are left. And that's really what we've got. In every watershed, there are patches of magical old growth forest if you know where to look for them.
Great. I think that is all questions. Oh wait, there's one more. Liz asked, if the chick is lost to predation, will the female lay another egg in the same season?
It rarely happens. We've documented it in about 5% of our birds in any given year. And it depends on when the chick is lost or when the nest fails, because sometimes it fails during the egg stage. If it's early enough in the season, say in June, then we have had birds relay an egg. We don't know why some females will relay and others won't. It might be the health that they're in, whether they had great access to good food before the breeding season, but we're not sure. So anyway, it does happen, but it's rare.
I've got something for Kim as we got a couple more minutes. This Oregon Murrelet project to me is just really valuable. And because the year that it was really bad ocean, we had incredibly poor nesting. And it played out in our community science things, and it played out because of the information that came from the tagging of birds and the realization that some of them went to California. You want to talk about that just a little bit, Kim, and make sure everybody understands how valuable that is?
Yeah, murrelets have always had to deal with good and bad ocean years, whether it was food or not food, or we had upwelling on the coast or we didn't have upwelling. But recently, since 2014, we've had several phenomena that have been happening that have really affected the availability of forage fish. And one of them is the blob. You might have heard about the blob that occurred in the Gulf of Alaska. Well, that kept warm water around for a really long time. And also the frequency of El Niños, it's occurring more frequently. And so those events together, along with changes in wind and changes in the jet stream, are having a huge impact on surface water temperatures, and that's not allowing upwelling to happen. So in the year Paul is talking about, 2017, none of our marked birds went to nest, and we had 60 some birds marked. Most of the birds left the state, or at least left the Central Coast study area. Some of them went to the South Coast of Oregon, but a lot of them went all the way to California to find food. So when there aren't good forage fish available near where they're used to foraging, they may not nest in that year, and they also may not fly inland at all. And so you get a decrease in inland detections, and then you get a decrease in the number of birds trying to nest. And that has a huge impact on populations over time if this continues. And this year is not any better than any of the other years. So it seems like since 2014, it's been pretty poor forage conditions for murrelets and other seabirds.
Okay, and we're just gonna take one more question. Marita asked, have any marbled murrelets been raised in captivity?
it's a rare thing to have happen where they survive. A lot of times when a chick that fledged the nest but didn't make it to the ocean, they'll crash land on the forest floor, and somebody hiking along might find them and take them to a rehab center. The issue is that usually they're very dehydrated, and the vet can't get them hydrated enough to have them survive. The best survival has been with chicks that are not of fledging age. So if they fall out of the nest early and somebody rescues them right away, then there have been several birds raised in captivity and released. But there aren't any kept in captivity. We tried to do a study looking at how murrelets molt. And so we captured 5 adults and put them in captivity, and it just didn't work. The other birds picked on them, and even when they were put alone, they wouldn't eat. And so those birds had to be released. And so it's no vet or even the aquariums have not been able to keep murrelets alive in captivity.
Great. Well, thank you, Kim and Paul, so much for joining us, and thank you for all the work that you do. It's really fascinating stuff. And I think Tanya wanted to close it off today.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Lydia, Austin, Kim, and Paul. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. And for the questions that we didn't get to, we will work with the panelists and try to get those answered and share that out in our thank you email that will go out to everyone that attended today. So thank you all for joining us. And like I said at the beginning, be sure to check our website for additional events that we'll be doing in conjunction with our virtual eco-regional tour series this summer. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks, everybody. Thank you.